Tuesday, May the 8th, U.S. President Donald Trump surprised the world by announcing his decision to renege on and withdraw from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, otherwise known as the Iran nuclear deal. However, Iran wishes to remain in the deal, and the signals from European signatories indicate they wish to also continue with the JCPOA. So what does this now mean for the Middle East? Can the JCPOA continue? And what ramifications will this have for Mr. Trump's meeting with Mr. Kim from the DPRK? To discuss these issues and more, I'm very happy to be joined in the Beijing studio by Mr. Hua Liming, China's former ambassador to Iran, as well as Mr. Harvey Zordin, a research fellow with the Center for China and Globalization. We shall also be talking via satellite to Mr. Pavel Fagunhor. He's standing by in Moscow. He's a military analyst, and we shall also talk to Mr. Gambar Nadare from Tehran. He is a columnist with Keyhan International. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui. But before we start, let's look at this.
It's no surprise that the U.S. is withdrawing from the Iran nuclear deal, but the U.S. is reimposing all previous sanctions and is warning Iran not to restart nuclear activities.
We will be instituting the highest level of economic sanction. Any nation that helps Iran in its quest for nuclear weapons could also be strongly sanctioned by the United States.
White House officials say the U.S. will immediately reimpose sanctions targeting critical sectors of Iran's economy, such as energy, petrochemicals and financial sectors. Companies will be given up to 180 days to end business with Iran. Failure to wind down such activities will risk severe consequences. The U.S. actions will make it very difficult for European nations who want to keep the nuclear deal to keep doing business with Iran. The European Union, Russia and China will be talking to Iran in the coming days. Tehran says it's willing to see if the deal can be salvaged, but won't hesitate to restart uranium enrichment if that doesn't happen.
I
ordered the Iranian Atomic Energy Organization to be ready for action if needed, so that, if necessary, we can begin our industrial enrichment without any limitations. Until implementation of this decision, we will wait for some weeks and will hold talks with our friends and allies and other signatories of the nuclear deal. Those who will remain loyal to the deal will talk. Everything depends on our national interests.
Meanwhile, unveiling a new controversial pressure policy on Iran, the U.S. says Tehran must never acquire a nuclear weapon. The White House also wants Iran to halt development of ballistic missiles and what it calls support for terrorist groups in the region. For nearly 3 years, world powers, except the United States, have said the Iran deal is working and Tehran is fulfilling its obligations. Now that deal is in tatters, and what Washington wants from Iran is a question that perhaps cannot be answered by diplomacy. Nathan King, CGTN, at the White House.
Gentlemen, first of all, Ambassador Hua Liming, what would be the worst case of consequences arising from the U.S. breach of this multilateral agreement?
The decision was risky because Iran nuclear deal, that was a deal. Limitation of the Iranian nuclear program for lift of the sanctions against Iran. Now, the sanctions, when sanctions lift, Iran certainly will restart their nuclear program. When Iran is going to restart the nuclear program, Israel will be very sensitive. And Israel promised that they will have some military attack against the Iranian nuclear program. And when Israelis started the military against Iran, necessarily the United States will be involved too. That will be a very risky and explosion of war in the Middle East. So that's why I call it risky.
My hunch is that what you want to say is that should economic sanctions be resumed, the nuclear ambition will be put into practice by the Iranian leadership, and that will risk a full confrontation with Israel and perhaps with the United States. And now, Mr. Zordin, what are your thoughts about the political fallout?
Well, John Bolton, who's a major actor here, has been on record as wanting regime change in Iran, nothing less. He's even chosen a successor group to run the government in Iran, somewhat similar to the situation on August 19th, 1953, when Iran had a coup led by the CIA of a democratically elected government. Bolton wants regime change, and that's what he's aiming for. I believe if the sanctions come on, that there's going to be a hot war, as the ambassador said.
Thank you so much. Let me go to Mr. Nadary, our Iranian columnist who's standing by for our discussion about the issue of common concern. Now, Mr. Nadary, why do you think President Rouhani decides to remain in the deal despite the very severe threat from the United States to completely suspend the deal?
Well, we should ask why Iran signed the JCPOA in the first place back in 2015. Iran wanted to prove to the international community, to the international civil society, that it is not after nuclear weapons, that its program is peaceful and it favors diplomacy over war and confrontation, which Iran says is unnecessary when we have the diplomacy before us. For the same reason, last night President Rouhani made it absolutely clear that he is going to give diplomacy another chance. He is going to send his foreign minister Zarif to the capitals of China, Russia, and of course the EU member states in order to talk to them, in order to see if they are going to stick around, if they are going to commit themselves to the nuclear deal, somehow to save it in the absence of the United States. But at the end of the day, he says, if it doesn't work, if the talks doesn't work, and we are not going to see any benefit from this, the nuclear deal, I'm afraid we are going to walk out too. So at the end of the day, the ball is now in the courts of China, Russia, and the EU member states. They are the ones that are going to decide whether they are going to cave into US pressures or stand their ground and defend this important diplomatic achievement, which, by the way, has proven successful from day one. It has managed to secure peace and stability in the region and beyond, and it has been a win-win deal for everyone. Let's cross our fingers and hope that somehow Europe, China, and Russia will help keep this important deal in place in the absence of the United States.
Mr. Zodin, what do you think of the impact of secondary sanctions?
Well, they're going to be very severe, as the President said, and the question is, how can they be avoided, or what are the workarounds? So some of them are that the EU has legislation that is a blocking statute that blocks enforcement of these secondary sanctions. Another thing is that a lot of the transactions could be conducted in RMB and euro. This would get around some of the sanctions as well. But it depends on how vociferous and how difficult the Americans are going to be, and Trump seems like he's going to be very difficult.
Ambassador Hua, what will China and Russia do together to minimize the negative impact of the American defiance, I mean, its effort to tear apart the deal?
I think Russia and China will be very firm supporter of this JCPOA, and the European Union, so far, they have been very firm on their stance. The President Macron of France and the Chancellor, German Chancellor Merkel, visited Washington and tried to persuade President Trump not to withdraw from the agreement. But I wonder if the Europeans can stand to the end of because many European banks, the European companies, they have their relations, connections, both with Iran and the United States. So, of course, their business in the United States or with the United States will be affected. So this is I think the key issue will be European standard.
Thank you so much. I think Mr. Pavel from Moscow is ready. Hello.
Hello.
Hi, Pavel. What do you think of the plight of the European Union, given the fact that it is facing sanctions against Russia and now sanctions being resumed against Iran? I mean, I mean, the market of the European Union will be seriously undermined as a result of the unilateral act by President Trump. What do you think of the consequences?
Well, Europe doesn't see Iran as a threat. The only threat that they thought may have come from there is its nuclear program, and so Europe was very, very good with this comprehensive agreement. And, of course, it's an opportunity to do business with Iran. Though for the European economy, well, this is not critical. The Iranian market is not big enough, I mean, to be just a very serious issue economically, financially, but it's also an issue of principle. But Europe finds itself kind of between a hammer and a hard place, because it's not just simply America walking out on this deal. There are kind of wars happening there, by proxy, of course, between Saudi Arabia and Iran, say in Yemen, between Israel and Iran and pro-Iranian forces in Syria. So that means that Europe may be facing a real serious crisis in the Middle East. As a result of this America withdrawing from the treaty, things can go from bad to worse. And this is quite closer to Europe than it is to the United States. So it's not just simply economic issue. There's military issues involved and strategic ones too.
Thank you, Mr. Hua Liming. Earlier on the campaign trail, Mr. Trump, the candidate, said he didn't like the nuclear deal with Iran. Now, do you think his administration has been held hostage by the Saudi and Israeli lobby groups, or it's rather the whims and decision of this president, who is known for his unpredictability, that matters by the end of the day?
I think Donald Trump's administration in his Middle East policy has been kidnapped has been taken hostage by Israel and Saudi Arabia. And of course he's taken hostage by his voters too, because he promised during the election campaign, promised to withdraw from the nuclear deal. So that's made, I think, many votes from that point, especially this period when he's been criticized by the oppositions, by the Democrats, and by the other parts of the United States society, and especially on the mid-election of November. So that will make me very anxious to have the voters' support. So I think this is the main point of
yes, indeed, the approval rating at home has been brought back to around 42% for the power base of President Bush. That's something, if it could be called a blessing for President Trump before the midterm elections. But at the same time, Mr. Zodin, what do you think of the credibility of the United States? I mean, I'm not talking about the United States. I'm talking about the Trump administration, because he withdraws from one multilateral agreement to another, like the TPP, Climate Change Pact, as well as the nuclear deal, the JCPOA nuclear deal with Iran. I mean, people are being driven mad by his defiance and his respect for multilateral agreement. I mean, this is something very big for particularly the U.S. allies in Europe.
Trump has always operated this way as a businessman, also as a leader now for the last almost year and a half. And I think the credibility of the United States is almost none, zilch, almost rock bottom at the moment, because if you sign an agreement that took 5 years to negotiate among 6 major countries plus Iran, and it was very hard fought, and then he just comes in and abrogates it. This is not what nations, responsible nations, are supposed to do. And so if I were Kim Jong Un, I'd be thinking to myself, all right, Trump's coming. If he signs an agreement, is it going to be good tomorrow? Is it going to be good next week, next year? I'm not sure.
Thank you so much. You are watching Dialogue with Mr. Hua Liming, Mr. Harvey Zodin, Mr. Nadary, and Mr. Pavel. We're discussing ramifications of the latest decision by President Trump to totally undermine and tear apart the multilateral deal on the nuclear capability of the Persian state, the Iranian Republic, Islamic Republic of Iran. We'll be back in a short while. Please stay with us. Just to follow up the promo about our special program on Karl Marx to commemorate the 200th anniversary, let me announce we're going to travel to Trier, hometown of Karl Marx, in a few days and do a special program called Dialogue with the World with our Germans. And we'll take with us a couple of Chinese scholars, Victor Gaozhikai and Professor Zhang Xudong from NYU. We'll be doing a special program on the 200th anniversary of Karl Marx. But welcome back to our discussion about Iran. Mr. Ambassador, what will happen next if the EU, in particular, decides to say no to President Trump? Will the European Union help reinforce the schisms or rift across the Atlantic Ocean?
I think the schism between the U.S. and the European Union is expected because it happened 10 years before.
Are you saying that the European Union will do more to take the future of their regional bloc into their own hands, like Angela Merkel said after she was turned down to have a handshake with President Trump in the United States?
Remember in 2003, when the U.S. started the invasion against Iraq, it was not approved in the Security Council of the United Nations, and two major oppositions are Germany and France. And so now I can see that will repeat again in 2018 when US and Europe will divide it over this issue. Although they cooperated in the case of the Syrian war and in the case of the Russian and the British relationship, but this time they have big differences because the benefits are different. US have zero benefits in Iran, but the European Union, especially France, Germany, they have big benefits in Iran, so they will not follow the US example.
One follow-up question about the consequences, Mr. Zordin, is what do you think of the prospects of using more of the RMB and EU instead of US dollars in settling major transactions between Iran, Russia? Both are pretty big and influential oil-rich countries and their partners in the future. I mean, do you think the position and authority of the US dollars, particularly oil dollars, will be seriously undermined? Because what Trump does today is to put America absolutely ahead of any other countries of the world.
I think it'll be undermined. How seriously, we don't know yet. But I believe that a development that took place recently in China is going to make a difference. And that is the petroleum market in Shanghai, which now clears oil future sales in RMB, not dollars. I believe more and more business will go through Shanghai. This is not good news for the dollar, and I believe it's President Trump who's driving this away from his country into Shanghai and to use these other currencies.
Let me go back to Mr. Pavel. Here is the conundrum in the Middle East, most volatile region in the world. We see the ongoing proxy war between Saudis and the Iranians, between Sunni and Shiites. Now, the dilemma of Saudi Arabia is, on the one hand, it has to rely increasingly on the Chinese market for the export of its crude oil. On the other hand, it bought so much of the American weaponry during Trump's visit to Riyadh. Now, what do you think of the ambition of the Crown Prince himself? What does he want?
Well, this is a dilemma for all the countries in the Middle East because America is, of course, still very important, but they don't have a coherent policy there. And how to deal with the Trump administration is not an easy, there's no easy answers. And of course, this is the situation there is not very good and could get worse. Today, the Israeli army has said that it's in heightened state of alert, possible clashes coming up between Iran and Israeli forces in Syria, where Saudi Arabia most likely is going to be seeing itself as a de facto Israeli ally. At least they'll be they're on the side of the Israelis, not on the side of the Iranians. And of course, the Prime Minister of Israel, Netanyahu, is right today in Moscow, observing the grand military parade on Red Square with President Putin. So, I mean, all the countries there are maneuvering in a situation in the Middle East where the future is totally seems bleak, and trying to find allies in a coming possible Syria in the region, which of course is going to reverberate in the whole world because the Middle East is still not the exclusive but very important supplier of oil and natural gas to Europe and to large parts of Asia. So this is a powder cake. And right now, the actions by President Trump will add it to that powder and to that cake. And now we're just waiting to see in which direction it combusts.
Yes, indeed. Israel almost reaches the point of having a full confrontation with Iran in Syria somehow. Now, since President Putin has won yet another election, which means for the next 6 years he's going to be in the office as president of the Russian Federation, do you think this JCPOA will be the #1 issue on his agenda, and does that risk a full confrontation with the United States? They are already on loggerheads over Syria, and do you think Iran, a de facto ally of Russia in the Middle East, will be yet another catalyst for further confrontation between Moscow and Washington? Pavel?
Of course, Russia officially fully supports the Iranian nuclear deal and says that the American withdrawal is wrong and that Russia will continue to support the deal. The thing is that there's very little economic trade going between Moscow and Tehran. And when the deal was signed, the Iranians kind of turned away somehow from Moscow, at least in terms of economics, and began making deals in the West where they're more interested to sell there and to buy there. So when Iranian relations with the West sour and possible sanctions intervene, that's a chance for Russian business to move in. And there's a very powerful pro-Iranian and effective pro-Iranian lobby here in Moscow. But there's also a very powerful and very effective pro-Israeli lobby in Moscow. And President Putin is known that he has wonderful relations with Prime Minister Netanyahu, and there's connections even between the Russian military and the Israeli military, and the Russian military and the Iranian military. So Russia is in a kind of middle position, and right now is trying to balance in this confrontation happening in the Middle East, though of course with America, yes, our relations are not good at all, but with Israel it's very different. So Russia
Thank you
is
so
trying
much,
to be
Pavel.
the indispensable, yes.
Thank you so much. Let me go to Mr. Nader in Tehran. China has been a very close business partner of Israel. We've been doing business for years, and we are the biggest export market of Washington, despite the ongoing trade war between the Trump administration and the Chinese market. Now, question is, what would happen should, by the end of the next 3 months, during the run-up, Iran show its defiance and economic sanctions will be resumed? What do you expect China to do in response?
Well, we don't wish any conflicts between our allies and allies of the United States. We want peace, we want diplomacy to prevail. We don't expect China to sacrifice its national interests for its Iranian allies. We want China to talk some sense to the US government to get them back to the nuclear deal. We expect the same thing from Russia and the European Union. Make no mistake, if Trump goes ahead and imposes severe sanctions against us, we will suffer a lot. We will suffer severely. But we have been through thick and thin over the past 40 years. This is not the first time that they are going to impose crippling sanctions against us, and certainly it won't be the last. We expect our allies, we expect our business partners to talk some sense to the United States and tell them that if they have some problems and some concerns about our policies in the Middle East, if they have some concerns about our nuclear program, or even the JCPOA, we have a commission, we have a committee. They can go there, they can talk to that commission and somehow find a balanced solution out of any kind of conflict of interest. But war, economic warfare, conflicts in the Middle East, attacking us diplomatically or militarily is not the way forward. This is not going to benefit anyone at the end of the day. This will only lead to a major world war that is going to
Excuse me, Mr. Nader, we know the consequences.
Iran, but
we know the consequences of a regional conflict. But what do you think of the real prospects of having a military confrontation with Israel?
Well, we are already at war with Israel in Syria. The Russian forces are attacking Iranian forces in Syria. They have killed Iranian forces, and we have so far refused from retaliation. But that is not going to continue forever. Make no mistake, we have missiles that can reach easily Israel. And we have refused attacking Israel for the simple fact that we don't want confrontation. But if the economic warfare goes on forever, if Israel continues to kill our soldiers in Syria or even in Iraq and elsewhere, I'm afraid we have no choice but to fight back. And when we fight back, as President Rouhani made it absolutely clear last night, both the United States and Israel are going to regret it.
You have made your position very clear. Thank you so much for being part of this dialogue. Last question, Ambassador Hua Liming. Our friend in Iran says over and over that China is an ally of Iran, but to my knowledge, we tend to call them a very close strategic partner. We don't call them ally. Even with Russia, we don't use the word of ally to describe the very special partnership. What do you think of our relationship with the Persian state?
The relationship between China and Iran has been always very good. The only factor is the American factor. We have to see that the fact. And China has been always asked by the United States not to have very close relations with Iran and to stop the trade between China and Iran. But China didn't accept all these. But under the pressure of the United States, China has to have some limitation to the relationship between Iran.
Well, thank you so much. What President Trump does is anything but Obama. Well, he doesn't like any of Obama's legacy. This nuclear deal is just one case in point. President Obama has joined the criticism against President Trump for doing this. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.